Ladies and gentlemen, just before we start another episode of the Fitzness Academy podcast, just a reminder for those who are listening on YouTube that we are now on Spotify. So please head down into the link in the description and check us out there. On with the episode.
I can be quite a reactive individual because I care so much, and I've learned to press pause and to consider facts and consider scenarios before I respond. So I think that would be my piece of advice to anybody is become self-aware and know your boundaries and don't feel like you have to know everything.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Fitzness Academy podcast. I have the honour today of having Renee McGregor on the podcast. Firstly, before I introduce her, thank you so much for coming on, Renee.
Thank you, and thanks for getting my name right.
No worries. I made sure, I'm not going to lie, I'm going to throw myself in the deep end, and I did triple check it to make sure, because I'm that's one thing that worries me the most. So I want to make sure I get it right 110%. So anyway, so obviously Renee is a leading sport and eating disorder specialist dietitian. She's got over 20 years of experience, ladies and gents. So just aside from all of her educational accolades, it's an unbelievable amount of experience, because you all know I value experience a lot of the time. In this experience, she's had a hell of a lot of time in Olympic, Paralympic and Commonwealth teams, if I'm not mistaken. And aside from that as well, you do ultra marathons as well, I've seen, no?
I do, yes. Yeah.
Wow. That's a topic for another conversation, but we're definitely going to dive into that one as well, if you don't mind. But again, thank you so much for coming on. And before we get all serious into the conversation, I'm going to act and bring my child self into this and ask you the icebreaker question of the day. And we had to obviously make it about food, obviously. Renee is a dietitian, so we had to just do it. So if you could have an unlimited supply of one food or drink, bearing in mind obviously you need it for performance as well with your unbelievably difficult sport, which I can't contemplate spending that much amount of hours running, what would that be? Remember, food or drink, so it can be both. You can blend it up as well. I'll let you get creative.
Oh, wow, that's so difficult. Oh my god, I think this is really boring, but I think it'd have to be peanut butter on toast.
Oh, getting the calories in as well.
Yeah,
definitely. I had, and it's quite a cool accolade to say for her, but I had the fastest Welsh woman of all time on the podcast a few episodes ago, and she actually said a very similar thing to a very similar question, which was, it was like a rice cake with peanut butter and then bananas on top, which I'm a huge fan of. So but I said one supply, so we're not going to get into that. That's cheating. So, no, but that's a good question. Actually, I had a lot of thoughts about it. I'm good that I challenged you because it's difficult. So moving straight on, can you tell us a little bit about your journey? Obviously, I know, and I like to take the side of someone who probably doesn't know a hell of a lot about nutrition. Obviously, I'm a strength and conditioning coach by trade, so I'm and we'll get onto it a bit later. I'm very, very keen on sticking to that. But can you tell us a little bit about yourself for the viewers who may not know of you, or who's living under a rock, or is just not opening their eyes, or?
Yeah. So as you said, I'm a sports dietitian. I actually started life off as a clinical dietitian working in the NHS. And worked in a number of different specialities because that's what you do as a dietitian. It's not that dissimilar to medicine, really, in that you start and you rotate. You're like a junior level and you work your way up. And by the time I left the NHS, which was about 7-8 years later, I had done sort of further qualifications in paediatrics and also specifically sort of adolescent eating disorders. So I kind of left the NHS in about 2010, I believe. Maybe just before, can't quite remember. It's obviously, as you've stated, I'm quite old. So
No.
My brain kind of frazzles on these kind of dates. But I've always been really, really sporty. Like as a youngster, I did swimming. Like that was what I started at. I started swimming when I was like 5 and carried on swimming until I was about 12. And I was one of those, swimmers that got in the pool every day. And then they started asking me to come in the mornings, and that's kind of where I was like,
Draw the line at that. No, thanks. I'm good, thanks. I prefer my bed.
Yeah, exactly. I think really what happened was, it's like that classic time when I'd just started secondary school, and I just felt like, and I was getting, it wasn't like, it was quite a long way to secondary school. So I was like walking to the station, then getting the train, and then having to walk. And it was all too much. And I think my parents just got to the point where they're like, how much do you really want to do this? And also, I'm not a very big person. So those of you who have met me, I'm actually quite small. I'm only 5'2". And so I kind of think got to the point where swimming, I was, again, good at the kind of endurance engine aspect, but I was never going to win anything because I'm just not tall enough. So I've always been sporty. Through school, I did netball, hockey, was always in the teams, always kind of, interested and involved. And I think I'd got to the point that I loved my work in the NHS, and I would never, ever change that, because I think that experience I got there has put me in really good stead for the information and knowledge I now have and continue to learn, continue to build on, should I say. But I definitely got to the point where I felt slightly constrained by the type of practitioner I wanted to be. And so it felt like the right time. I remember my boss at the time when I sort of said, look, I think I need to move on. And she said, you know what? Yeah, you're the kind of person that needs to be free, and you think outside the box, you show initiative, and the NHS is definitely not going to support you in that because of the need to hit certain protocols and policies. And, so she gave me my blessing, and she, in fact, weirdly, we still see each other every now and again, bump into each other because I'm still living in the same area. So I still see her, and she's always really kind of excited to hear what I'm doing next. And see, I didn't realize that she follows me and knows what I've been doing. It's all very weird, but
it's brilliant, isn't it? Brilliant.
Yeah, exactly. So then I moved. So I basically decided to do a postgraduate qualification into applied sports nutrition. So I'm definitely somebody that, you can call it imposter syndrome, you can call it self-doubt, you can call it whatever you want, but I always feel like I want to feel like I've made the steps to understand. And yes, I had dietetics and a biochemistry degree, but I still wanted to understand sports, like the physiology of the body and kind of how it's different when you're working with well individuals rather than unwell individuals. So I did my postgrad, and that kind of led me to where I am today, in the sense that sort of started working in the field of sports nutrition, and soon realized that there was a very big gap between sort of performance nutrition and clinical nutrition. And I felt that I had the ability and the knowledge to bridge that gap, particularly when it came to dysfunctional behaviors around food and exercise. And that's kind of where we are today, in the sense that, I've worked, as you said, in numerous different specialities within sport, from, Olympic level, Paralympic level, different disciplines, from gymnastics to, wheelchair fencing, wheelchair basketball. And all of that has been, amazing. And I always take as many opportunities as I can. Fundamentally, if an opportunity arises, I'll say yes, because, what's the worst that can happen? You'll probably learn something from it. So that's kind of my attitude in life. And I think through that, it's made me realize that there's a massive gap in the sports world when it comes to individuals who need help with their dysfunctional relationships. And I suppose that's what I predominantly do now, although I still do a lot of work in performance nutrition as well, but tend to help people on their journey to get back to that place.
Well, I'm lost for words, because I've got a list here on the side, and I haven't sent this to you, Renee. You can testify for this. I've not sent this to you, and you've actually covered a lot of the points that I was going to speak about. Okay. So, it's all right. It's all right. We'll carry on. No, but obviously we got some more points on that one, because this is an area where I wanted to delve into a bit more detail. because you mentioned that little gap you had where you worked in the NHS and that master's degree, which I'm at the moment, or master's level, sorry. They talk a little bit about, why did you keep going in education and why didn't you just go into the working world, if you like? What was the reason why you did that? What was the reason why you kind of said, right, no, I need to step away here after getting the blessing from your boss and say, look, I think I need to go back into, or maybe not even think about back into education, because a change can come in many different ways. But was it a change to go back into education for you, or was it a change to possibly try something else?
It's a really good question. I knew that I wanted to work in sport because, as I said, I've always been sporty, and by this point I was running and I was running for my local club, and lots of my peers were asking questions all the time about how they could improve their performance, and although I kind of knew the basics, I was like, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this properly, which is kind of my attitude to everything, and sometimes my Achilles heel as well. So I am aware that I need to manage that slightly driven perfectionist side of my personality. And I was also like, I had, I'm a mum to two daughters, and they were very young at this point. And I was juggling a lot, but it just felt like the right time. I could study in the evenings. The master's was one where you only had to kind of attend a certain number of weekends within that time period. So it wasn't like I had to be at university every single day, and it just fitted with life because it meant I could look after my girls during the day, work in the evenings, do my assignments, go and attend the weekends that were needed. And I love learning. Like, even to this day, I spend a lot of time reading and educating myself and doing additional courses. Like, I think, something I've realized recently is a lot of people ask me, well, how do we get to have the knowledge that you have? Can you teach us? Can you do I get asked to do lots of presentations and workshops and webinars. And I guess the answer is, I can give you so much information, but the reality is that I love learning. I love understanding what it means to be a human being. And there's a lot of that you can't teach people, like it's the fact that I've got a certain amount of education, but I think it's very important to appreciate that education and theory is relevant, but it's not always relevant in practice. And so it's being able to combine the two that I think makes people really good practitioners. I don't think you can just be an academic and state the theory and not really see how it works in action. Like when you're doing a research study, for example, everything's quite controlled. And actually, in real life, it's not. And so it's all very well to say that you need X amount of grams of carbs to do this. But the reality is, actually, how do you know that if it's, the conditions are different, the duration is different, the intensity is different. So I think we need research, 100% need research. But what makes a really good practitioner is somebody that can read the research and understand it and use the evidence to support practice, but actually it's also the hands-on practice and getting to know the different potential outcomes that can happen and knowing how to respond to those. I hope that makes sense.
No, it does, and I think that's the beauty and why I love working in sport so much. Is because you get that almost, I don't know if you've ever heard of it, it's the saying almost like, not every day is going to be different, or no 2 days are the same. That's the one. And that's what I love about it, because although you have you have your basic sort of scheduling. For example, myself, I work in both cricket and football, so I have an idea as to, I think, what you mean there, where you have you have this sense of, oh, what we're going to do today, or who's going to come into the clinic today, or which athlete am I going to deal with today, and what problems are they going to have. Again, it falls under the beauty of working in sport. I think working in the health sector, and I have like a tiny bit of experience, nowhere near yours just yet. I would be so glad if I had the amount of experience you had by the time I retired. But what is it for you that keeps striving for the experience then? Because you've had this eagerness to learn more. And again, that was another thing I was going to touch on is you're always learning, aren't you, as a practitioner? You don't stop learning. You know, you need to keep on top of new research coming out, like you mentioned. But what about experience for you? You mentioned, again, how, you know, you always throw yourself at opportunities and experiences. Do the two come hand in hand?
Yeah, I mean, I think experience comes through putting yourself out there. And if an opportunity occurs, a lot of people are fearful of change or get very comfortable in what they do. And I suppose I'm not fearful of failing. So I've worked in some sports and gone, that definitely is not for me ever again, you know, but again, I still learned something from that. I think sometimes you have an instinct that, oh, well, I'll try this method with somebody, and then it doesn't quite go to plan. And it's like, okay, well, what have I learned from that I can take forward and move? So I'm a very ambitious, driven individual. I definitely have a type A personality. Like I said, it doesn't always put me in good stead. And I'm very, very mindful of my personality type. I think people often wear perfectionism as a badge of honor. And actually, I see it as the complete opposite. I see it as my Achilles heel, something that potentially can create quite a lot of dysfunction within my behavior. So, but I think the human body is so fantastic and so interesting. And I've, like, ever since I was a little girl, ever since I did my GCSE biology, I just found it fascinating, which is why I wanted to go and do biochemistry, because I wanted to understand how the body works from a cellular level. I wasn't just okay with, well, this is the Krebs cycle and this is glycolysis. I wanted to understand more. And I think that's just how I am. I don't think, I'm not sure that I create loads more opportunity. I just think I'm a really curious individual. And, like, you know, in more recent years, I've been fascinated by the brain and how the brain works and what the brain needs to function properly. And more recently still, I've been looking at kind of the nervous system, because all of it fits together. You know, you can't just look after somebody physically. You have to help them psychologically and emotionally, but equally you have to understand how their lifestyle and also potential scenarios can impact their nervous system, which then can also have a negative impact. So I guess I like the puzzle of it all, and I like trying to put all the puzzle together. Sometimes I get it right, sometimes I don't.
Was that the reason why you kind of have branched both into the health and performance side in a certain way? Because obviously we've obviously spoken about your time in Olympic, Paralympic and Commonwealth teams, but then we've go on to the side with your experience with the NHS and obviously what the books that you've written, which we'll talk about in a second, where you go on to specific details about sort of gut health and things like that, working with eating disorders, which was a big thing for me to talk to you about. Is it broadening your horizons to being a dietitian as a whole? Because obviously you've got to specialize somewhere, I suppose, or at least that's what education tells us to.
Yeah, I went into sport thinking that I was really performance orientated, and soon learned that I wasn't. Soon learned that actually I care too much, and I got told by one of the organisations I worked for that I cared too much. that was really what led me to leave very high performance, like leave the Olympic, Paralympic type sports, because I was like, well, if I care too much and that's a problem, then that's not an organization I want to work for. Because as far as I'm concerned, if you don't look after your athletes, both mentally and physically, then you don't get performance. And I'm not prepared to see an athlete as a commodity. For me, an athlete is a human being that needs to be nurtured and nourished. So I think that's a real big passion of mine. And I'm also very, a bit of advice I give younger practitioners when they're kind of at a crossroads in their career and they're not really sure where to go next. And it's definitely what I did at that stage, is you have to look at your core values. You have to look at what is important to you as an individual. And I actually do this in clinic with clients as well. It's like, if you understand what it means to be true to you, you then can find the job and the kind of the relationships even, and the friendships that fit you. Because when you are not working towards your core values, when you are not living and being true to yourself, this is when fundamentally your own needs are then not being met, and you're trying to mold yourself into being somebody that's not you. And that is not comfortable, or it's never going to lead to a happiness or contentment. So I guess for me, I moved into this more holistic area, if we call it that, because I think it's really important to see humans as a whole, and not just entities. Not just a digestive problem, not just a mental health problem, not just a performance problem, but actually to bring it all together. So I would say I have specialized, but I think, I've got so much experience that I bring snippets of all of that into my daily practice. And that's just something that comes with kind of experience and time, and being in roles that you learn from and not always enjoy, I think.
Do you have to look at as well, to a certain extent, what the industry is kind of after as well? Because I know I'm finding it myself an issue at the moment, where you look at all of the jobs that come out at the end of the season as a strength and conditioning coach, and you're like, well, that's not as many as probably about 10 years ago, when strength and conditioning coaches started to become a thing in things like cricket, for example. Is it sometimes about, as well, obviously you do get two sides of the state where you're like, right, cool, I can get experience in another industry here, another sport or another company, but I really do want to do this. Do you have to sometimes look at what the industry needs?
That's a really good question. I don't think I've ever thought about it from that point of view. I think I follow my passion. So yes, I do look at what the industry needs, but I still want to follow my passion. I'm not going to change my practice or change what areas I want to work in just because that's what is required. So what I mean by that is, obviously I feel very, very passionately about health and mental health and, on the back of that, performance. But I'm also very aware that if we are to change the present climate in terms of, we're seeing a higher prevalence of mental health issues, including self-harm, including eating disorders. If we are to change that, then we have to think about prevention, which means we have to provide some sort of education to schools, to governing bodies. And so I guess if I was thinking about, well, how do I make an impact there, then I'd still be talking about the things I'm passionate about, but I'd be like, okay, now I think it's really important that we do some coach development, or we do some, programs for schools to help youngsters understand the potential risks if they don't get balance right. So yeah, I guess to a certain degree, yes, but I'd still say I follow my passion.
And that's what I was going to ask you. I was trying to ask that question in a certain way because you've had so much experience in so many different areas. So I was a bit confused as to sort of what area you preferred in a bizarre way. Because obviously now moving on to it, now your stuff with eating disorders and you went on, you had a big part to play in Freddie Flintoff's bulimia campaign or documentary, I believe. Can you tell us a bit more about that? Because I'm a big cricket fan. I'm an absolute Badger, so obviously Freddie Flintoff is someone I've looked up to for a long time. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, it was a really it's quite a surreal experience, if I'm honest. I get contacted a lot by documentary and filmmakers, especially when they're talking about areas around dysfunctional relationships with food, or around eating disorders, or around even things like sort of female health. I do get a lot of organizations and like I said, filmmakers contacting me saying, please can you provide us with an interview, not necessarily to be on screen, but just to kind of provide the research, I guess, and the background and the understanding. And I'm very happy to do that because I genuinely don't like being in front of the camera. So for me, this is how this started. Was I was contacted by this producer, and I was contacted because I think I'd helped somebody they knew, a family friend's daughter or something like that. I can't remember exactly. And they said that they wanted some insight into eating disorders, but also insight into kind of how to make this program safe and how to make it responsible. And would I do an interview with them? And I said that was fine. And so I did an interview. And then they said, we'd like to see you in practice. And I can't really offer that because obviously due to confidentiality aspects. So I was like, I can't do that. But I said, I am speaking at a conference. It was the Royal Psychiatry, College of Royal Psychiatry's annual conference, and they'd asked me to speak. And so I went to speak at the conference, and the producer came along and heard me speak, and then afterwards contacted me again saying, look, we'd really like you to work with Freddie. What do you think? And I was like, well, I'm not going to say no, but equally, is he ready for change? Is he ready to speak to me? Et cetera, et cetera. I didn't actually appreciate that they meant, will you work with Freddie on screen and be filmed, until a few weeks later when I was invited to Lord's and then met Freddie for the first time. And the first thing Freddie said to me was, I don't like dietitians. So that was really great. And quite frightening. Not a great
start, was it?
I know, exactly. So, but yeah, I guess it was an interesting experience in that, I just went about it in the way that I would always go about any sort of consultation. I had to try and forget that the cameras were there. And actually, although I was, on screen for whatever it was, 10 minutes or whatever, actually we were chatting for a whole day. So there's a lot that goes on. And then afterwards, when they put the documentary together, they asked me to be the first person to review it, again, to kind of make sure about the safety and the message and, all these different things. So it was an interesting experience. There's only so much influence you can have. But I feel like they did a really, really, really good job. I still have questions. I still have areas about it that I kind of think, it would have been good to have demonstrated this. But equally, we have to respect how much Freddie was also prepared to share. So yeah, it was a very surreal experience, is what I would say. But again, an opportunity, and I learned about being on TV, which it's not something I particularly want to repeat in a hurry, if I'm honest. So.
Well, it's another experience. It goes back to what you said, throwing yourself in the deep end, isn't it? It's definitely the deepest end to a certain extent. But moving on from the program, because one of the reasons I got into sort of learning more about you was through your most recent book, But what about what was your first book, I believe, what was it? Orthorexia, because I've learnt a lot about muscle dysmorphia and didn't know if the two sort of interlinked in a certain way. Do you mind just telling us a bit more about that topic area of orthorexia?
Yeah, of course. Although orthorexia was my fourth book, so just kind of. But yeah, so orthorexia came about because it's about 5 years ago now. So I'd written Training Food, and I'd written Fast Fuel for Watkins Nourish Publishing, and they sort of come to me and said, like, what are we going to write about next? And I was like, oh, I don't know, I'm not sure. I said, I would like to write a book about eating disorders in sport, and they're like, oh yeah, we're not sure, that's a bit niche. So that was fine. They didn't say no. They just said, let's just explore what we've got. And then I happened to be invited to Cheltenham Literature Festival to be on a panel with B. Wilson, Madeline Shaw, and Eleanor Mills, who was the chair, and the topic was the clean eating debate. That was kind of what the kind of talk was about. And also this was 5 years ago, where it was like hashtag clean eating everywhere. Everyone was talking about it. Everyone was spiralizing vegetables, and it was all that kind of weird thing that people did. And I was seeing it more and more in clinic. I was seeing lots of athletes who would only eat in a certain way and were very fixated and, were very, very much influenced by this kind of new group of, should we say, food bloggers, food influencers with no qualifications, but very much producing information for people and very pretty pictures and creating a lifestyle that I think lots of young, vulnerable individuals would aspire to have. So I went along to this event, and it didn't end too well, in the sense that the audience were very much there to see Madeline Shaw, and they turned against both myself and B when we were basically talking about the fact that, clean eating is quite dangerous. I've never experienced anything like that, but it was really quite frightening, and real kind of thrown into that kind of like trolling environment in terms of the kind of the way in which both B and I were treated, should we say, by the audience. There were also lots of people that were very much pro us, and we did get a lot of support as well, but fundamentally it was quite an awkward and difficult experience. But on the back of that, literally the next day, my publisher rang me and said, right, because Twitter had gone mad and B had written about it in The Guardian, and so literally, I got a phone call saying, this is the book we're going to write about. We're going to write about orthorexia, we're going to write about clean eating, and we're going to talk about why it's so bad for you. And that's kind of where I guess it's come from. And I suppose, it's an interesting area. And actually, I'm part of the International Task Force for Orthorexia, and we have so this is 5 years later, but we have just submitted a consensus paper on diagnostic criteria for orthorexia now. So up until now, it hasn't been seen as a formal eating disorder because there hasn't been any diagnostic criteria, but we have now submitted that. And so we're waiting to see if that gets accepted. And if it gets accepted, then that will go into the DSM, and so will become something that is diagnosable. And it's been really, really exciting working with this group of individuals. I mean, there's sort of like 25 of us from across the world all working on this consensus paper. And I cannot, honestly, it has been back and forth and back and forth and back and forth over the last 5 years. It's a lot of work that goes into consensus statements. So it's quite an exciting time. And from that point of view, and I think people are becoming more and more aware that orthorexia does exist. And obviously what it is this kind of this obsession with eating purely, this obsession with eating clean, this obsession with kind of getting it right, and actually very much about health. And I definitely see it more in the physically active population. I think it's definitely very, very rife, and more in men, I'd say, than in females. So absolutely bringing in kind of what you're talking about in terms of sort of muscle morphia, if you want to call it that, or body dysmorphia, or, this kind of these absolutely strong food rules and beliefs that if they do not eat in a certain way, then almost something awful is going to happen to them, or they won't be pure enough, or they won't be healthy, or they won't get the gains that they believe that they've only got because they've followed these very strict rules. And there's kind of whole food prepping and
Tupperware disorder.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I'm sure Tupperware are very happy because I'm sure their sales went through the roof. But I find it fascinating, if I'm honest, because like people always say to me, do you do food prep? And the answer is no, because I quite like to be responsive to my hunger. Like if I'm hungry, I'm like, okay, well, what do I feel like eating? I don't want to have a meal that's ready prepared that I thought I might want to eat last night, but actually I don't really feel like eating it today. But that's just me. And I appreciate for some people it's very helpful to be organised and prepared. And yes, I definitely cook in bulk and put things in the freezer. I'm not talking about that, but I don't tend to meal prep my whole week in advance, personally. So yeah, orthorexia is an interesting one. I think it's a very easily disguisable condition because of, the kind of, I suppose because of the popularity of things like wellness and the way in which we attribute wellness to the way we look. And also I think now maybe it's not even wellness. I think people have cottoned on to the fact that wellness is not something that we should all be striving for. But now we talk about health, but obviously health being still the way we look, the way we eat, the way we train, rather than health being actually an attitude and a lifestyle. And I always say to people, for me, being healthy is more than what I eat. Like that's an important element to it. But actually being healthy is being able to sit around a table and eat food with my friends and family and loved ones, because that brings me well-being. And that social connection part of health is often overlooked. So I think health is so much more than just a number. But yeah, I think orthorexia definitely is one of those things that people will kind of go, well, I eat like this because, and this is why we see it in athletes so often, because like, well, I eat like this because I'm an athlete and I have to. And I think that's why it gets missed. And also because it's not fixated necessarily on a body composition or a body aesthetic. It's more about this obsession with getting it right that I think, people don't always pick it up.
That little quote that you did before about sort of having like sort of an openness to your eating and being able to eat around the people that you love was one thing which I took from the book, because it gave me a sort of a different way of seeing it. Because I think a lot of people think, socializing, I'm just talking to people, but like the whole, not just that, different cultures as well, I suppose, that use food as a mechanism to bond with each other and stuff like that. So it's more than just sort of the calorie in, the calorie out, and which is become this sort of global only cause of eating, and people think that they're eating just to fuel themselves, but they lose the fact that food is enjoyable sometimes,
Yeah, totally. And I think it's really sad. I find it really, really sad that we, if people don't enjoy food anymore, that we've lost the enjoyment of food, because food is, mouthfeel, texture, flavors, like you said, cultures, being able to share a different culture with somebody and let them sort of invite them into your upbringing. What if you think about romantic relationships, like so much of getting to know each other is over food and reminiscing about things you did as a child and what you might have in common, or actually also inviting them in to learn a little bit more about you and your favorite foods or your kind of family comforts or whatever. So I think, I don't know, for me, food is something that is so much more than just nutrients. And obviously nutrients are critical and we need them for our bodies to work efficiently and effectively, but food is more than that. And I think it's sad when people can't enjoy food for what it is.
How do you sort of then go about not fixing someone? That's quite disrespectful, but how do you go about sort of helping someone from that standpoint of someone being like, no, Really, I need to eat this way to look a certain way. How can you then start to look at possibly helping them out and understand? I think if we're looking at something like maybe competitive bodybuilding, it's completely different because that's a completely different way of life and a completely different attitude towards things. But how can you, for just a general gym goer who's seen this bodybuilder and looks up to this guy and has no aspirations to compete in professional bodybuilding, but has this almost Tupperware mentality, how can you sort of try to help these people like that?
Well, I think the first thing is to help people appreciate that all human behavior has a purpose. So while the fixation is on food and body image, that's not the real problem. That's just the kind of medium by which they're trying to express themselves, communicate, attain worth, all these different things. And I think I always start off when I'm working with clients, getting them to appreciate that their behavior has a purpose. And often that purpose is protection. So if somebody is very much fixated on body image, actually, what is the purpose of that? What is that protecting them from? Why is it they need to attain worth through their body image? And it might be that, historically, they have sought approval through the way they look. Or we know, in the Western society, it seems that generally speaking, the way you look in some ways is how people then make a decision about who you are. It is kind of an element of your identity to a certain degree. If you look a certain way, then you must be living a certain way, which I think is really strange because obviously, you get lots of people who eat really, really well, but actually might not look the kind of body ideal. And then you get people who eat really badly and they may look like the body ideal and people are like, well, how's that possible? So I think, to start with, it will all be very much about kind of appreciating your behavior and what it's trying to do. And then it's about rewiring and changing that relationship with food. So understanding the food rules, understanding the food beliefs, and trying to help them to appreciate that actually these are just beliefs they hold. They're not real. They're not factual. They're beliefs they hold because they've repeated them in so many times that they feel incredibly real to them. So, it's about kind of getting them to take a chance, to take a risk and change. And the only way you break down beliefs is to change the sort of the behavior to then demonstrate that you no longer need to hold that belief. So it's not a simple process, and it's definitely something that there's not a one size fits all. I don't go in with the same approach with every single person. It's very much dependent on what's being placed in front of me. And I'll work with what is needed. Often I'll send people off with tasks to go and think about, questions to go and answer. But actually, if they come to the session with something pressing that they need to talk about in that moment, then we'll discuss that. So I think, and again, I think that's going back to sort of where we started. I think that's what makes people good at their job, good practitioners, is that ability to create that psychological safety and safe space that an individual feels they can bring whatever is bothering them to the table. Is probably linked to everything else, but it's a good place to start if that's what they're prepared to talk about.
Well, that's amazing. So what would you have to, and you mentioned it being holistical in a certain way, and that's it was a completely different scenario. It was a quote from your website, but do you have to be holistical with the outcome of your session sometimes, understanding that potentially this person might not be able to be helped, but possibly might need a bit more time, might need a few more sessions, might need a bit more time to talk to them about what is truly going on? Because I think it depends on each person, doesn't it?
100%. And, I think one thing I teach my team, the practitioners that work for me, is that sadly, there will always be some people who can't be helped, and that's just life. That's not a personal thing. That's just, in order to improve your relationship with food and body image and exercise to a certain degree, you have to appreciate that these behaviors have been techniques of avoiding something that's a lot more deeper rooted. And the individual has to want to face that. They have to know that it's not going to be a comfortable place, and that actually recovery involves actually really going into yourself and experiencing things that are very, very hard, even to the point of experiencing aspects of yourself that you might not like very much, but actually being honest about that. There'll be certain scenarios where you can only really improve the quality of life for that person, but you might not necessarily be able to help them to be completely free. That said, we have a lot of success, and we do have people who are very free. But I think there are always individuals that you just, I wouldn't say early on, I don't make a decision in the first session, but I think, if you're sort of 6 to 9 months down the line and you're still talking about the same things and there's not been the ability to move them forward too much, I think you have to think about reevaluating their expectations and your expectations of what the outcome is going to be. And that can be a tricky conversation to have, but I think it's always good to be honest. And I'm definitely somebody who will say to somebody, do you know what, I'm not sure what else I can bring to the table here. If we're going to move forward, then you have to meet me somewhere. And at the moment, that's not happening. So you need to maybe think about what it is you really want from this. And then we can discuss what that looks like. And I think the other thing is that sometimes you'll set goals and tasks and outcomes for the individual that are too big, and you have to, they'll come back and say, I couldn't do it. And it's like, okay, that's cool, not a problem. We'll just step back a bit. We'll step back a little bit, and we'll start again. And we'll make a little smaller step, because it's always about, and I think for me, because of the experience, I've definitely got to the point where I know when something's going to be too big, and so I don't even suggest it anymore. But I think when you're first starting out, it might feel like you want to change everything. I know one of my practitioners, when he first started working with me, he just wanted to change it all in the first session. I was like, no, we can't do that. Like, just one thing at a time. Because he just cared so much, and he wanted this person to thrive. And, so I think it's important to consider who you're working with, and then decide on what it is you're going to start with first, and make that something that's achievable. Because, we all know that if we get reward from our behavior, we're more likely to stick to it and continue on down that path. So I think that's an important aspect of practice.
No, for sure. It's definitely important. But does it sort of not hurt you, but does it upset you sometimes when you potentially can't help that individual that possibly, it's a bit too much? Does it upset you? Because I know I feel that way sometimes, if an athlete possibly moves on from a sport or moves on from sort of the practice in general and says, no, look, you can't really help me anymore, then they need to go and see a physio, for example, like that. It doesn't hurt me, but, I always overthink and think, was it something I did? Could I have done more? Is that something that sort of affects you when that hopefully doesn't happen, when it happens, but obviously hopefully it doesn't? Is that something that you feel? Does that upset you?
Of course, yeah. I'm an incredibly empathetic and compassionate individual. And what upsets me is not that I haven't been able to help them. What upsets me is the loss of potential for that person. The fact that that person is stuck and they are still suffering. That's what I struggle with the most, is that I'm incredibly empathetic and feel people suffering. And again, that is my strength, but it's also one of my weaknesses. But it's also why, I have a clinical supervisor, because actually sometimes you have to know when to step away and go, sadly, this is just what it is. Yeah. And again, I think that comes with experience. I think some of the younger practitioners in my team really, really struggle with letting go. And that's my job, to help them to realise that actually in certain situations, that is just what it is. You've done everything you can. There's nothing you can do differently. And, it takes, the individual has to want to change. And sometimes people stay in that place of contemplation to change for a really long time. And sometimes they never move forward from that place. And that's not about you as a practitioner. That is sadly just the environment and the situation. So I think Yeah, 100% it affects me, and I do get upset. But I also get upset quite often after clinic most days, because what I'm working with is really, really sad. You know, people who are not able to fully live their lives because of the choices they make, because of potential societal pressures, because of, you know, rules and beliefs that keep them stuck, because of the deep rooted hatred that they feel about themselves. I mean, I cry most days. Like, that's kind of normal. So yeah, it's an interesting, you know, it's an interesting area to work in, and it's not easy.
No, I think a lot of people see the sessions or possibly hear about them, but they don't see the endless hours where you actually speak one-on-one with someone, when you actually get down to who they are, how they've been living, what's occurred to them, and it impacts you a lot. I think whoever says that they didn't care or could let go a bit easy is probably not passionate, but like probably isn't like sort of ingrained in themselves. So, and what we're going to do is, because I understand Rena's time is very valuable, we're going to go into the Q&A section. This is one thing which is a newer sort of implementation that I've put. Normally I just keep it as a surprise who's coming on the podcast, but I thought it was quite good for the viewers to get a bit of an in-depth view and ask questions here. So one of the ones that we got were sort of tips and supplements that you recommend for waking up not tired. I'm not too sure what they meant in that respect. Possibly something like something with caffeine in it, or sort of something which possibly helps you go to bed so you don't wake up tired, or something along those lines.
I mean, I think if you're waking up tired every single day, you've got to look at a lot of different things. You know, first thing I would say is, you know, get your bloods checked, have a look at things like iron and vitamin D, make sure that they are in the right place, because that isn't often a common cause for people to feel tired. I think you have to look at your stress, overall stress, like, have you got a stressful job? Are you going through something stressful at home? Actually, are you putting too much stress on the system through your training and not fueling that appropriately? Are you sleeping properly? Again, you know, people don't realize that if you're not fueling properly, then you're usually going to be staying awake, because your body is searching for food. It's looking for food, and it's going to stay awake. So I think I don't jump in with a supplement straight away. I mean, the only supplement I would recommend that most people should take in this country would be vitamin D, and that would be between the months of September and April. But otherwise, I think it's really important to try and understand what might be deficient, whether that is a nutrient or whether that's actually a lifestyle factor.
Well, that's what and that's an interesting point you made. Oh, lost for words there for a bit. That like supplement is before we go into the second question, supplement is a massive thing where obviously the industry absolutely butchers it and think that it's a necessity, when they actually need to break down the actual definition of what supplement is, there, isn't it? So it's the same thing with things like amino acids or branch chain amino acid supplementation, where everyone's like, no, you shouldn't have this supplement. Well, a lot of people can possibly live without supplements in general. You know, they're there to supplement you in case, you know, you haven't got it there. You know, obviously vitamins and minerals are probably something a little bit different, where, you know, it's probably a bit more of a necessity to have more rather than less. But I think the fitness industry butchers it, don't they, with the whole need for supplements. You have to have it.
Yeah, I think also people think if they take a supplement, it's like an insurance policy, you know, and actually there are certain vitamins, particularly like water-soluble vitamins, if you take them in high doses, they don't really stay in your system very long. So you're kind of just peeing out expensive wee, you know. So it's like, I'm definitely a food-first approach. I'm definitely, as we've talked about all the way through, I'm very much about holistic, like, look at what's going on. Like, I know that if I'm anxious, my sleep will go off. If I drink too much alcohol, my sleep won't be great. Like, you know, you kind of know when you're going to be affected. But I definitely think if you're feeling tired day after day after day, then actually you have to look at your overall lifestyle, not just that you can pop a pill and make it better. Awesome.
What an answer that was. So the last one I've got for you, because this is one that I'm really passionate about, and it might not come across that way, but it is, because I'll get into it in a second. So does it bother you or frustrate you that personal trainers and other fitness professionals provide nutritional programs or even advice as a whole Now, I'm going to say my say on it rapid, and then I'll let Renee say it. Even if it is sort of on Instagram or anything like that, I try and avoid it as much as possible, because the simple answer to this is because I am not a dietitian. I am a strength and conditioning coach, and I stick to that, and that's as simple as I go with it, and it's quite simple. You know, it's black and white. There it is. So what's your opinion on it? Because it's dangerous, isn't it? It is dangerous. It can be very, very dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, I get very frustrated. I get quite, depending on my mood, I can get quite angry. Because I've seen the direct effect that poor information can have on individuals and their overall health and well-being. And, you know, it might be an innocent comment. It might be, to boost their own income or whatever, but fundamentally you are playing with people's lives. Now, the thing I would say is I'd like to think, and it's because I'm a nice person, I'd like to think that nobody puts out poor information through malice. I believe that they truly think they are saying the right thing. But the problem is, you know, human beings are not machines. We are not transactional. We are not just calories in versus calories out. We are a complicated set of biological processes that all interact together. And so saying that if you do X, Y will happen is being very dismissive of how complicated and amazing the human being is. So I appreciate I have got several years of experience, lots of qualifications, and I read constantly about the human body, which gives me this insight. But in the same way that, you know, you have said, you know, you wouldn't talk about nutrition because it's not your job. People will come to me and say, or you know, can you write me a running program? No, because I'm not a coach. And even within nutrition, there are certain areas within nutrition that I haven't worked in for years. So I would not give advice. I think it's really, really important to know what your boundaries are and to understand that we are not simple. And I find it quite insulting more than anything else when people kind of just go, oh, well, if you eat less and move more, you'll lose weight. Yeah, you will lose a small amount of weight to start with. You will maybe get some aesthetic gain for a short period of time, and then it will become dysfunctional. And then the body will go into compensatory behaviors and shut down. And that's where it becomes a problem.
And that's obviously, that's why I wanted to include that question, because that goes, I reckon someone who probably maybe got offended by that, you know, you, like you said, possibly in a certain manner, you know, you're not going to go to an accountant and tell them how to do all their sums, but you know, that's what accountants are there for. They're there to do their job, and that's it. So, and I get frustrated sometimes, you know, because I think that something like a strength and conditioning coach, you know, like for myself, you know, I've spent 5 years now nearly at university studying, and I'm not even finished yet, you know, and then there's some people who write it in their bio on Instagram or their bio on LinkedIn, and right, bam, they're a strength and conditioning coach, when it's not the case. And a lot of people think it's maybe like one or two words or an acronym or whatever it may be, but it does influence people, and it does sort of make, that's why I put aspiring strength and conditioning coach in mind, because it can sort of go so far in, and you know, people, you're also probably manipulating some people in a certain way, because they're like, oh, he's a strength and conditioning coach, you know, but he's still at university, you know, how does that make, I'm going to go for him because he says it that he is, you know. It's the similar thing with yourself, you know. I've seen it a bunch of times, you know, where people put, I'm a nutritionist or something like that, and then I'm like, well, are you a nutritionist or are you a dietitian who's actually registered, who actually knows, you know, or maybe not knows, but is actually qualified to give advice?
Yeah, and I think obviously there's a big difference between dietitians and nutritionists in the sense that, you know, dietitians is a protected title. So actually, when you are working with a dietitian, generally speaking, you know, they've got a minimum of a 4-year degree, minimum. And we also all have to be part of the HCPC, so the kind of Health Professions Council, which means we have to work within a strict code of conduct. So, I don't work on feelings, I work on fact. I use evidence base to direct my practice, but obviously you also use, to a certain degree, instinct and extrapolate from the evidence in scenarios where there is no evidence. There's only evidence if the question's been asked, right? So yeah, it's an interesting one. With nutritionists, there are absolutely registered nutritionists who have a degree level minimum as well, but the problem is the title is not protected, and so anybody who does any sort of nutrition qualification can call themselves a nutritionist. And this is where I get a little bit frustrated. And I know the AFN get very frustrated because they are trying to get it protected, but lots of loops, I think, to go through.
Yeah. Well, like I said, it just becomes like to a certain point where it could become dangerous, isn't it? In certain points. So hopefully, you guys get an insight as to being careful if you are a practitioner, because I know there's going to be a few people already who are going to listen to this who are possibly in university or possibly just going towards getting their accreditation. So definitely watch out for that. And on to the closing notes here, because I've gone over time slightly and I'm feeling a bit bad, but I need to ask this question. Has there been one or a number of individuals who have influenced you as a dietitian and as a practitioner as a whole?
Yeah, I mean,
where do I begin?
Gosh, yeah, exactly. I mean, I work very closely with Dr. Nikki Kay, who is an endocrinologist, and we've become very good friends. But I have so much respect for this woman, and I think there's a definite mutual respect there, in the sense that often when you're working, particularly when you're a dietitian in the NHS, and especially when you're a junior dietitian in the NHS, often you are just kind of like this, you're just there, and consultants and a lot of medics don't really respect you or what you have to say. And for me, Nikki was one of the first medics that gave me an opportunity and a chance to to show what I was capable of and what my knowledge was. And, I think we've learnt a lot from each other. I know she would say the same thing. So definitely I would say she's influenced me and given me confidence to practice. And, even now, even like a couple of weeks ago, she's like, I think it's time for you to do a PhD now. So I'm like, I don't think so, but but yeah, I mean, she's brilliant. So I'm forever grateful for her. But I think for me, actually, some of the people I work with as well have really given me confidence to believe. Like, I didn't always believe that I was good or good enough. And I think, just kind of working with individuals, and I never asked them to give me feedback, but when people come back to you and say, because of you, I have such a different attitude towards food or a different attitude towards life, you start banking that and you start using that as evidence. And the other person that I guess has probably more recently influenced me, and again gives me real confidence, and apart from obviously my partner, who I couldn't be without because he supports everything, but in terms of from a work perspective, would be Kimberly Wilson, who again is an incredibly amazing clinical psychologist, and again become a good friend. But I've just again have so much respect for this woman, and I love that I've chosen two women who've empowered me to be a strong woman. But I really do, I think I'm very fortunate. I have a very, very strong network of incredible practitioners and people I look up to. But these two women particularly have very much influenced and shaped how I am today. So, I I think it's too.
It's like you said, isn't it? It's networking. You know, I think as soon as you close yourself off to learning from other people, you know, like you said, it doesn't always have to be, oh, how did I do there? How did I do there? How did I do there? You know, understanding them and understanding their journey. You know, I know I've learned a hell of a lot from you today, and you've definitely sort of changed my perspective on it, even being in the industry myself. But yeah, it's all about networking. You know, talk to people. You know, that's why I started this podcast, is to talk. You know, I'm not very good at reading, so I can talk for days, as you are aware. But yeah, and what about and the last piece, and this is something which I've carried on throughout the entire 37 episodes now. What is one piece of advice that you would give to anyone wanting to be the next Renee McGregor, or the next registered dietitian, or the next sort of anyone who wants to influence anything?
Piece of advice, I would say become self-aware. Self-awareness is so important. Knowing what your weaknesses are, what your limitations are, what your personality type is like, and how that will potentially how you'll respond in different circumstances because of that, I think is very, very useful. So I can be quite a reactive individual because I care so much, and I've learned to press pause and to consider facts and consider scenarios before I respond. So I think that would be my piece of advice to anybody, is become self-aware and know your boundaries, and don't feel like you have to know everything. That's a bit too many bits of advice there, but you know.
The more the merrier. The more the merrier. No, what a way to finish, ladies and gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen. There we go. So yeah, thank you guys for watching so much, and thank you to Renee for coming on. I'm going to leave all of the links in the description to all the social medias where you can purchase all the books. I put an individual link for each one as well, so you can purchase it. And thank you so much for coming on.
No, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
No worries at all. And thank you guys for listening as well. Take care.